family violence and advocating for women's reproductive freedom since the 1970s. She's a graduate of the University of Houston. She's worked as a columnist for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, a documentary filmmaker, and appears on Inside Texas Politics on WFAA television. She wrote and produced a documentary on Freedman Cemetery Memorial in Dallas, a desecrated burial ground for former slaves transformed into a monument for African American heritage. And she also worked on a documentary on LGBTQ Anglican Christians in Africa. She says her passion is to use her access to media platforms to give voice to the voiceless, the powerless, and the marginalized. So these are our panelists. I'm going to ask them a few questions, and we will leave some room for you to ask questions to them at the end. Okay, so now I have to find my list of questions. Okay, so I reviewed the oral histories of these women that are in the portal to Texas history, and I was struck by the fact that Carolyn and Katie, who began their careers in the 1960s, were automatically ushered into the women's sections of the newspapers where they worked. At the time, women's sections focused on food, fashions, and furnishings, as well as society news, because at that time, that's what women were supposed to cover. Bored, Carolyn Barta tried to get out by applying for a job as a political writer and was told, you know, you can't go out onto the golf course and pick up tips, and you can't go to bars with the politicians, so we need to fill this job with a man. Are you shocked or no? She did eventually get the job she was looking for, but she had to share it with a man. Also, a few years later, Carolyn was pregnant with her first child, and she was forced to quit her job because pregnant women couldn't work in the newsroom. She had to later reapply for her job and get it back. When Katie got hired, the hiring manager asked her, what kind of birth control do you use? And asked if her husband would approve if she had to travel for work. These practices must seem difficult for our students to believe. And I want to ask Carolyn and Katie, how did these experiences lead each of you to pursue successful careers focusing on the issues that you wanted to report about?
Well, never underestimate the power of a pissed off woman. I was just shocked and amazed, and I quickly realized that the powers that be were paying no attention to what was being covered in the women's department. And they literally paid no attention. And so I thought, well, the women's movement, the new women's movement was just beginning to gather steam. No one in, of course, the real newsroom was covering it. So I started covering the women's movement, interviewing feminists who came to town, who came to TCU to speak, who came to SMU's Women's Week, remember that, and doing stories about it, and news stories, and began to build up sources, and then Sissy Farenthold ran for governor, and no one was covering Sissy. I mean, the real political reporters weren't covering Sissy, so I did. And so when it became clear that Sissy might actually win a primary, which in Texas was winning, the editor came to me and said, you need to give all your notes on Farenthold to so-and-so. And I said, no. And I thought, I'm going to lose my job now, but I said, no, these are my notes. So they called Farenthold's office, and as wonderful as she was, she said, I already have a relationship with a reporter at your paper, send Katie Sherrod. And that's how I got to cover politics. I was still in the women's department, but at least I was covering politics. A little subversive activity.
Well, I started out in the women's department, and it was not just that that's what they thought women should cover, but the male editors at the time thought that's all women were interested in. So there weren't women working on the city desk except in maybe there were a couple of things they allowed women to do, maybe general assignment or maybe education or health and medicine, but you couldn't cover any of the hard news beats like crime, police, politics. And back in the 60s, there weren't any women sports writers. There were no women sideline reporters. There were no women in management other than the editor of the Women's News. So there just weren't, the opportunities weren't there then that are available to you guys today to cover almost anything that you are really interested in. But it took me a good long while to get where I wanted to go. And I quit, actually. I left the morning news, and I thought I would freelance my way around the world. I got as far as Hawaii, and I worked there for a while. And Kennedy was assassinated, 1964. And I had friends from college who were in Washington, and they were active in the civil rights marches that were going on at that time. And I looked at my life in Hawaii, which was pretty great on the beach and learning to surf, but I thought, everything's happening back home, and I want to be part of that. So I came back home. I went to Washington because I wanted to learn more about government. And I got a job on Capitol Hill, and I learned about government, politics, the making of public policy, and I said, that's what I want to do. So I went back then to the University of Texas at Austin and got my master's degree in a program called Public Affairs Reporting. So then I went back to the morning news and I reapplied. And at least that time I got a job on the city desk. And so I was able to start out writing obits. And just gradually, it probably took maybe, I don't know, several years anyway. My first really good hard news beat was City Hall beat. And I thought that was the most important thing in the world. And I still think it's important. One of the concerns I have about what's happening in journalism today is who's going to cover community news? Who's going to cover City Hall? At any rate, 1972, and I think that was Sissy Farentho's year, I did say, I want to cover politics. And they said, the local political beat came open a couple of times and I was passed over. And then in 72, they said, okay, you can cover along with Dave McNeely, who was a still writes politics in Austin. And so we split it up. And who knows, a woman could do a good job at that. And so I just from there spent the next 3 decades or so in some way either covering politics, some national politics, some state politics, serving on the editorial board as Leona is now, and still writing about government and politics.
Okay. Now I have a question for Gail and Leona, who both won Pulitzer Prizes in 1994. They both won the prizes for projects that focus on gender and on race. And what I'm interested in knowing is, how difficult was it for you to convince your editors that these stories needed to be done? And how did you convince them to back your efforts to do this kind of work?
Well, I was in Akron at the time, and Akron, for some of you who know, is a city of black people and white people at that time. The white people lived in a part of time in town, and the black people lived in the other. And so I think this project actually started from a school controversy about the quality of schools in neighborhoods. And we were brainstorming ideas about how we could tell that story. And it evolved into a year-long series covering not just schools, but my part of it was housing and business and crime. So it turned into a year-long series. What was fortunate, I was in a good position in that we kind of gerrymandered the reporting teams, because at that time, we paired a black reporter and a white reporter on each of those subject areas, because it was clear that people were not comfortable, as they are not still, talking about race. And it was, I think, our ability to relate to the folks who were living who we were trying to talk to, that allowed us to get the kind of information that we got from them. So I was one of about 4 reporters of color who were on the project, and 4 white reporters who were on the project. And so I was kind of in the lucky spot of there were not many journalists of color in Akron, but we were all on that project. And so it didn't take a lot of convincing, but it took us a while to try to figure out what was the best way to approach the story. And if we were going to get people to be frank and honest, we kind of had to gerrymander the project. And so it worked out pretty well for us. We got some pretty compelling stuff from them. You know, I remember things like I'm with my partner in the car. We're going through some neighborhoods. We often travel together, though one of us took the lead on the interviews. And, you know, there's a kid on the corner, black kid, had on what I call teenager clothes, you know. He was sitting on the corner, and she reached over and locked her door at that particular moment. And I remember we were close enough now to have these frank discussions to say, why did you lock your door just then? I don't drive around with my doors unlocked either, but I lock them when I come out of the garage. And so we were able to have some pretty compelling, frank conversations about what was inside the reporters' heads when they cover stories as well. And so the project, we didn't have to do a lot of convincing, but we had to get comfortable with each other to have those kind of frank conversations.
Yeah. Well, so the Violence Against Women project started out, I had convinced the people at the Morning News to let me do a beat. It was a halftime beat on women's issues. And so I was already doing that. And there's a great person named Pat Gaston, and she was either on the foreign desk or the national desk. And she wanted to do a project that had something to do with the worldwide status of women, but that was too vague. So she created a file in our, what was then state-of-the-art, now ancient computer system, that where we could all drop stories in, ideas, things we found on the wire. You could put them in the Hey Pat file. And so there was this very unusual for newspapers, I think, a very collegial process that went on where the people who wanted to work on this project, and there were a bunch of us, we would meet and sit around and talk with a couple of editors about, you know, how are you going to define violence toward women? You know, well, does it include killing baby girls? Yep. Does it include not educating girls at the same level? No, we're going to say that doesn't, you know, come under the heading of violence. But so we put together a proposal for this project, and I think that pretty early on it had the management's imprimatur. You know, they were gonna approve it. But I believe Kevin Merida in management was the person who made it happen. And so we put together this outline of the project. And I remember that Ann Reifenberg, another reporter, and we did some of the initial research on it. She worked at the Star-Telegram. Katie, I believe, hired me at the Star-Telegram before I was at the Morning News. And so we developed this theorem, or whatever we called it. And it was about, because in cultures around the world, you know, violence against women in some way was culturally accepted. So our Reeves-Reifenberg theorem was something like, women may not be beaten except by, virtuous married women may not be beaten except by male members of their family or their husband. Because that was like the only thing That was all that the world could agree on. Everything else was okay in some culture or other. At any rate, so we did a lot of research, and there was a group of women who had started an effort to get the United Nations to officially recognize violence toward women because they were women as a human rights violation, just the same way that religious-based violence or race-based violence had been accepted as a human rights issue, meaning that it was of interest officially to the whole world how you treated people in this category, not just your own private business, okay? So we decided to craft a series of stories that would lead up to the time when we knew that this resolution was going to be considered by the UN. And the project team was pretty big. It was not all women. All the photographers were women, but there were several guys who worked on as reporters. But we sent people around the world. I mean, it was not a small effort on the Morning News's part. They invested some real capital in it, and all around the world to do stories on different forms of culturally accepted violence, honor killings in India, forced prostitution in Thailand, which is what I covered. Honor killings more in Latin America, bride burnings in India. In the United States, of course, we have, rape and domestic violence happen here as often or more often than in many, many countries. And so that's how our series got started.
Okay. There's some issues that we've been talking about recently in media, such as the pay gap, sexual harassment in light of the Me Too movement, women still being minorities in newsrooms. Journalism is still made up of 37 to 40% women. The rest are men still, even though most of our students are women. So I'm wondering what kinds of challenges you see women still facing in newsrooms of today, and maybe offer some ideas of how you think these problems could be solved. Yeah, we're going to solve them all here today.
It's interesting that you mentioned those particular subjects, because on the editorial board, one of the things I have been able to do is to explore some of those issues in greater detail. And the pay gap, I recently wrote a column about how women typically still don't make on the dollar, obviously, what men make, but that women also don't ask for raises as often as men do. And so I wrote a column about how important it is to have a voice. You won't get it if you don't ask for it. You want your employers to obviously do the right thing, but they're not going to do the right thing unless you ask. And I wrote a column about how to do that, about a lot of high-profile cases recently where women quit their jobs after they found out that men were the same job they were doing, making more money. And I had about 5 women in the newsroom come to me I might as well have sat out a little shingle. I had folks coming up asking, I gave a lot of tips on what to do your research, try to do some market analysis. They're not going to give you the salary structure for everyone, but people tend to share some information, find some trusted sources to try to figure out where you are. And telling people you just have to ask. And sometimes you're going to be in a position where you have to make some tough decisions if you go and you ask and they say no, and you're not making the amount of money that your colleagues are. But I think the issues continue. They're perpetual. And the numbers that we've seen recently for women and minority women, in particular, in the newsroom are just not where they need to be. And I was talking to one of your students earlier about what we can do about that. And some of the things we've discussed is trying to grow our own. I mean, women are leaving the newsroom. Women of color are leaving the newsroom because they see a lack of opportunity. We have got to figure out a way to grow our own. That's why we have still a robust internship program at the Morning News. Most of them are women. And most of the women who work in the newsroom are folks who used to be interns. And so we have to somehow figure out some way to get more women interested early and keep them there.
I would say that one issue that was prevalent when I started my career in journalism was maternity. There was no such thing as maternity leave then, or even certainly not paternity leave. There was an unwritten rule on my first pregnancy, there was an unwritten rule at the Morning News that you could work until you were 6 months pregnant, and then you had to quit. And so I didn't want to quit because I needed the money. I went to the city editor and I said, look, I need to work as long as I can. We need the money. And he said, okay. And he was a very progressive editor, city editor.
Who was that, Karen?
Bob Miller. In terms of women's issues, married to a feminist who was active in women's issues. So he said, okay, just, continue working until somebody notices you. Somebody from the fourth floor, which was where the officers resided, management. So one day, one of the execs walked through the newsroom. We were on the third floor, and he noticed me. It was hard not to notice me. I was 7 months pregnant at the time. And I was gone the next day.
Was he emotionally damaged by seeing a pregnant woman in the
I don't know, but the next time I got pregnant, again, Bob Miller was my editor, and he said, okay, you can come back on a certain date. I was going to be off, I think, 3 months or something like that. And when I came back to work, the first time I had to wait for a job to open up that they could rehire me for. But I went back on the second time, and when I showed up in the newsroom, he said, okay, go fill out the paperwork and take your physical. And I said, why do I have to do that? I've already done that. And he said, well, you were terminated while you were gone. Wow. So what it meant was I lost all my seniority. 20 years later, we had more progressive management, and I went to management and said, I've lost several years here in seniority. Can you bridge my service? And they did it. So, but I want to reinforce something, what Leona said, that looking back on my career, what I remember most about women in journalism at, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we didn't speak up for ourselves, and the men did. They would say, I want to do this. They would say, I want to be a managing editor. I want to go into management. Women thought that if you worked hard and did a good job, that you would be noticed and you would be promoted. Well, it doesn't work that way. You have to advocate for yourself. And many of us deserve a seat at the table and can get it if we advocate for ourselves. The other thing I wanted to say is about the maternity issue may have gone away, but still relevant are so-called family issues for women, because women are still mostly the caregivers for their children. And I think that a lot of newsrooms have not embraced flexibility for women who have young children.
I think one of the things that I would also suggest is finding a women mentor in the newsroom.
Yes,
hugely important for you. I work for a woman who, if I needed to work from home half a day because I was trying to get to one of my kids' function, one of her functions, I just did, and you were allowed to do that. But as a boss, boss, I was a newsroom boss for a number of years, you have to model that before I even had kids, you know. Find someone who you can talk to about, hey, I'm having this problem. I want to be at my kids' activities. I want to have a life, you know. How do you do that? I had a woman who gave me some, as a boss, I had mentors at the Morning News who gave me advice, hey, at the end of the 2 weeks, we're all even. I get a paycheck, I put in my 80 hours, and we're even as a company, and it's okay to go home, you know. You have to find some people who you can talk to, who you can work through these issues on. I remember my kid was long through breastfeeding, but we were renovating the Dallas Morning News, the old building, and they had all this paint left over. And I happened to go into the room where the women were supposed to nurse their babies. Good God, what is this place? It looked like a prison. I mean, some of the newsroom where you're, you know, for women who were working journalists, find someone to talk through these issues and try to get some solutions to work.
The internship programs, you know, everybody in my classes know I say this, but, you know, if you're going to do anything to promote your career, go out and get an internship before you leave college. You know, it's just hugely important.